Welcome to Across This Quiet Land, Stories from the Hearts of Canada. I'm your host, Gerard Damon. Some stories arrive loudly, sirens, headlines, urgency. Others come quietly. They ask to be held rather than shared. Across This Quiet Land is about the stories that demand patience, the ones shaped by memory, responsibility, and place. Today's conversation is not about a single article or a single issue. It is about what it means to tell stories when the land remembers, when communities remembers, and when journalism itself carries a history. We're recording in Winnipeg, Treaty 1 territory, the homeland of the Anishinaabe, Innu, Anishinaabe, Dakota Oyote, Denisulaane, Nehethowak nations, and the birthplace of the Métis Nation. Our guest today is Lenard Monkman. Leonard, welcome.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Now, I want to begin with identity, place, and journalism. How does journalism position itself when it comes to telling a story for you?
Journalism is meant to be non-biased and as objective as possible. And throughout the years, I've tried to present things in a very direct way, like as clear as I can. I think sometimes people can try to over dramatize a story or whatever. And I've always been like, here's what this person said, here's what this person said, and here's kind of what's happening. And for me, one of the things about the experience that I bring is that I'm an Indigenous person who has grown up in Winnipeg and in the inner city, and I've lived on my reserve for a couple of years. And the things that I've been through and the things that I've seen and the things that my family and my community have been through, there's not a whole lot of other journalists out there that have had the same type of experience as me. And so a lot of the perspectives that I bring to the newsroom, that I bring to the stories are sometimes things that haven't been heard before, right? And I'm not just saying that about my story, but the perspective that I bring in, the people that I know, I'm bringing it to a different audience or to an audience that hadn't heard these types of things before.
That makes sense, yeah. Now, we started with, the land acknowledgement. Now, how does acknowledging the land change the power dynamic between the journalist and the subject?
It depends on how you feel about land acknowledgements. I think that sometimes it's like it's been used. Sometimes our community has mixed reactions on it, right? Like I know that there's a lot of mixed reactions on the land acknowledgements, right? I think that it's good that people acknowledge it, but like it kind of misses the opportunity or it comes out hollow oftentimes, right? Because especially in, 2025, when you look at the situation that our people are living in, like, there's a lot of people that are still being displaced in 2025. Right? There's a lot of overcrowding that exists in First Nations communities. There's not enough housing up there. So families are having to relocate to the cities and, the affordability crisis. And so there's like lots and lots of people that are being pushed out of their houses in neighborhoods where, like the north end of Winnipeg has always traditionally been, or not traditionally, but has been a native neighborhood for a long time, right? And, the demographics kind of shift because of the affordability part.
Now, what happens when reporters refuse to situate themselves at all?
I think a lot of reporters do try to not situate themselves, right? There's this idea that journalism is objective. And one of the things that have come up in journalism circles is that, objectivity is a myth within journalism. Right? Because everybody has a story, everybody has a background, everybody has a bias, everybody has a way that they think about things. And, we've seen that throughout the course of Canadian media, right? And through Canadian media, it's always been presented from one perspective of our society, which is a Caucasian perspective. And it doesn't necessarily reflect the values or the experiences or the lived experiences of different communities or diverse communities. And so I think that it's helpful to have multiple perspectives in places like a newsroom, right? Where, there's more than one community that needs to be covered.
Right. Okay. Now let's look at entering journalism in early lessons. What drew you into journalism, actually?
So I grew up in the North End, and I spent a lot of time with my granny when I was a kid, and she lived in Central. And so I would always go there on the weekends and stuff like that. And like I would watch the 6 o'clock news, the 10 o'clock news, the 10:30 news, the 11 o'clock news. And then I'd wake up and look at the newspaper when I learned how to read. And then I would watch the 6 o'clock news again. And so it's always been something that's always been a part of my life. Like we've just always watched the news since I was a young boy growing up in the inner city. And when I graduated high school, I remember thinking to myself, like, when I'm done high school, like I either want to go into journalism or I want to go into politics. And when I went into university, I started studying politics instead and kind of dropped out, got into trouble, and kind of ended up coming back to it. There's a long story that's attached to that part.
Feel free to share.
So yeah, like when I was in high school, I was in grade 12 and I was the valedictorian of my high school. And went into university, did political science courses, and then started selling drugs. Like I ended up getting into trouble. I ended up having to drop out of school at the time. And I ended up getting charged in 2009, waited for court for 2011. Then I was on house arrest for 2 years, 2013. And then what kind of helped me to get my life turned around was basketball, actually, like getting out there and playing again and staying busy. And like coaching came up a year later. And 2015, I was about to turn 30 years old and was doing flooring for 5 years. And, it was always like too smart to be on the floor and I want to try something different. I don't want to kind of go into being an older man and having a bunch of regrets. And so, just started getting involved in the community, started up Red Rising magazine, started volunteering, started doing community organizing, made it a goal to start writing as much as possible. And through all of that work that happened, CBC was like, hey, can we repurpose this article that you wrote for Red Rising? I was like, yeah, like banged out a couple of edits for them really quickly and did one more article. And they liked the response that they were getting in terms of what I was writing, plus the editing time that it took, like it was super quick. And then, so now that it's December right now, I just hit my 10-year anniversary since when I started at the CBC. And so I remember 10 years ago. Thank you. I remember 10 years ago walking into the CBC and just being like, I can't fucking believe that I'm here. Cause there's a lot of shit where life has gone left a lot, especially during my 20s, where it's like, okay, like I was amazed that I made it to 30 years old. At 30 years old, like being at the CBC kind of was just a blessing. Like it's been a blessing ever since I turned 30 years old, but since the beginning of 2015. But, I was back in university at the time. So I restarted university when I was at the CBC. And then during that time, I was like, hey, I got my foot in the door. I'm going to do everything that it takes to stick around. And so I quit university again. But the first story that I ever worked on was, it was a TOV, which was pretty new at the CBC. I mean, it was like the first TOV, one of the first TOVs at the CBC at the time.
What is TLV?
It's a text over video. Al Jazeera Plus was doing them where, we would tell a story, but then there would be text over the video.
Right.
And so I pitched it to them like, hey, we should do something on the TRC. The TRC released its final report December 15th, 2015. I think I started around December 7th or 8th, something like that. And so I had a chance to I was only in on a 2-week contract. And the video that we produced or helped them to produce did really well. And they brought me back on a 3-month contract in the January, and it's been there ever since.
And what early ethical lessons shaped how you work, when dealing with different subject matter?
I don't know if there's ethical lessons more than there was like goals, like because of like what I was saying about, growing up in the North End, like, and the community that I come from, like, my goal was to put as many Indigenous people on the radio and on the internet news and to introduce as many people as possible, right? And so a lot of the people that I had talked to for journalism over the years are oftentimes were their first time talking to the media, right? And it's through the social media connections that I made like over the years where I'm like, I already know what you're going to say about this thing because I've been watching you for so long. And you don't know that I'm watching, but I'm like paying attention to what people are saying about certain things. And so, there's like, started off with CBC Indigenous, and then they put me into the radio department where I was producing radio pieces. The goal is just to put as many different experiences as possible, right? Like one thing that needs to be said, especially among our own people, is that it's okay to have a difference of opinion, right? Like me and Nigon aren't going to think the same things about one thing, and me and Kevin Sheaf aren't going to think the same things about one thing, right? And that's like the way that it should be looked at, is that there's just a wide range of opinions on a wide range of issues, right? And so the more people that can understand that part, then the better it is for the average listener that might be watching or paying attention to something like the CBC.
Well, that makes sense. Yeah. Now, how do you decide what kind of journalist you did not want to become?
I think at the start of my CBC career, it was really to try and bring as many fresh ideas as possible, right? Like I've always prided myself on jumping on the waves, or like kind of trying to get ahead of the waves, like social media trends. Things have changed quite a bit over the years. Like the journalism at the end of the day still needs to be journalism. The way that it's presented to the people is going to constantly change. And the one thing that I was very grateful at the beginning of my year was to have producers who saw talent within me and gave me the ability to experiment with the types of journalism, with the treatment, with the videos. You know, I've done a little bit of everything when it comes to working at the CBC. You know, I've done radio hosting, web writing, news reporting, podcasts. When I say jumping on the trends, like, 2016, I think it was, Facebook Live was just coming out. And this was like this opportunity that I saw, like, when I started at CBC Indigenous, I think there was 20,000 likes on Facebook. And within a short amount of time, I think we got it up to 100,000 likes. And one of those things that I tell people sometimes is that I had access to CBC Indigenous social media account on my phone. And I got sent out to go and record a thing on the weekend. While I was there, it was at a residential school event, and I was standing there with Rai Moran. And I was like, "Hey, Ryan, do you got time for a quick interview?" And he's like, "Sure." So I just like punched it into the CBC Indigenous Facebook Live account and went live on their social media account. I got into trouble for that one. But I also proved to them that there was numbers of people who would be watching in that particular situation. And I don't recommend doing that kind of stuff at your work if you're wanting to try an experiment, because that was something that I haven't done since. And I've been trusted a social media account holder for a long time. But it's stuff like that where it's like, you kind of need to figure out, okay, well, we need to go where the audience is, right? If the audience that we're trying to reach is on TikTok, we need to go there. If they're on Instagram, we need to go. We can't even go on Instagram and Facebook because of the Meta news ban, right? So maybe that's potentially something that will change. All three of these apps will die and something else will pop up, and it's up to the next generation of journalists to kind of step into that role and be like, okay, here's how we're going to do this. But the journalism still needs to be journalism.
Very true. That's not going to change. Now, let's talk about, you mentioned, urban Indigenous life. What does urban Indigenous life reveal that other narratives miss? So we have a lot of people talking, but you've lived it. And I think that's the big difference. But there's narratives that are written out there about urban Indigenous life. But I think that your understanding would have a deeper connection than what other people would say.
I asked a question recently about whether or not things have gotten collectively better for our people since the release of the TRC. And for me, I think that's a perspective question, right? It depends on where you live. It depends on where you work. It depends on how the last 10 years of your life have been. And for me, the last 10 years of my life have been the best years of my life. They've been great. I've worked very hard to get to where I'm at. But as somebody who lives, I live close to the neighborhood that I grew up in, and I have to drive that way every single time I want to go downtown. And so I see these things every single day. And I'm still very much connected to my family, who has gone through all of the things that I've gone through and still goes through it, right? And when I think about all of the people that I grew up with and the people that were in my community, things have collectively gotten worse, in my opinion. And there's a lot of people that are from my generation that are no longer here, right? And there's a lot of people that are missing. And, when I was talking to somebody that I've been working with over the past few months. I don't know what the question was. She was like, what do you think about the North End and how it's changed? And she was like the soul is missing, right? It's like, it's not the soul, it's the people that are missing. It's the people that make up this community. And so for me, like, it would be different, I think, if I lived on the south side of the city and just never had to drive by or never had to see it, right? It would be like, okay, life is cozy, life is great. I see all these Indigenous people that are working at this place. But when you're like close to the hood, it's like, okay, this neighborhood has changed a lot, and drugs have affected our community a lot over the past 10 years. And the cost of living has affected our people a lot. Sometimes I think that the reconciliation era kind of allowed Canadians to kind of just wash their hands with it and be like, well, we did that. I'm glad we did that. You've got an orange shirt day and everybody does that. But then there's also like this growing wave of like residential school denialism, and then people that do say it's time to get over it. We already did that, right? And so it's a tricky situation when you're living as Indigenous people. We can use it in other contexts in a settler society that doesn't always think the best of you, right? And those race relations, when it comes to being an Indigenous person, are challenged every single day in this city, right? You think about the hospitality sector, the shopping sectors, transportation, like all of these different things. Like, our people are discriminated against every single day, especially when they're living in poverty, right? And it's hard to put a grasp on what that looks like for somebody who's not Indigenous. You kind of have to walk in our shoes for a week or for a month, right? And, you talk to Indigenous women professionals who, when you sit down and talk to them, like, I still get followed around every single where that I go. I still get asked to pay for the cab every single time that I jump in a cab. Like, there's a lot of shit that happens when it comes, especially if you're darker, right?
Yeah. How does policy fail urban Indigenous communities?
I don't think that there's a will to actually change it sometimes. I think that the way that politics happens will always appeal towards who the majority voter is, right? And if Indigenous people in a city, in a province, in a federal riding are the minority voter, the things that we need as a community aren't necessarily going to be advocated for on that particular level, because we are not seen as the voter, right? And so I think that there have been opportunities with the last federal government to change things. I think that there were some changes that were beneficial for some of our people, but some of the more longer standing issues when it comes to things like housing aren't necessarily addressed. Like, there's still drinking water notices in a lot of First Nations communities. And personally, I think that one of the biggest missed opportunities over the last 10 years, especially with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was education. I think that there could have been more of a focus on education to say, we're going to do this and this for First Nation schools. We're going to do this for urban Indigenous schools. We're going to lift the 2% cap on funding for post-secondary students. One of the famous quotes that comes out of the TRC is that education is going to be the thing that's going to get us out of this situation that we're in. And education was kind of like not put on the same par as other things, right? And so I think that I personally believe, like, and this is something that was instilled through me, through my grandma or through my granny, was like, education is the most important thing that you can do, right? And I'm a firm believer that, if kids are taken care of in schools, or if they're being pushed in school or whatever it is, like, that's where we see the change. You need to imagine how different this country will look like when all of these young Indigenous kids that are 14, 15, 16, 17 walk around with their head held high in confidence, and they're proud to be who they are, instead of, so many kids that go to these schools, they have to walk with their head down because of all of the shit that they face, right? And so I want to see like schools supported and stuff like that, and kids being supported in schools, because I feel like that's where the long game is really in that particular part of society.
Now, let's talk about, myths about Winnipeg. There's myths that persist about how stories, are framed about Winnipeg. So what myths still persist?
I don't know exactly what the myths are. I know that there's a lot of stereotypes that are perpetuated about Winnipeg, about our community. And I can only talk about what the things that I've seen. I think that the Canadian media has had a role to play in, things like the homicide capital or the murder capital, and we were the most racist city capital, and blah blah blah. And there's a whole bunch of different things that can be used by the media to sell a certain narrative, right? And one of the things that I try to do is to counter that and say that, what, I always tell people all the time, like, Winnipeg is home to um, some of the brightest, most talented Indigenous people in the country. No disrespect to anyone else in the country, but we have a lot of like very smart writers. There's poets, there's athletes, there's actors, there's activists, there's leaders, there's grassroots leaders. We've got like a wide range of people that have that know what it's like to see or experience struggle within this community. And when I say struggle, I'm talking about like the economic parts, but also that systemic racism that we see as Indigenous people, right? And through these things emerges this like very strong and resilient people. It's very hard to be an Indigenous person living in poverty in this city. And that's one thing that people don't understand, right? Is that if you're a Native person and you're living in poverty, what's it like to go and rent a house? What's it like to go and advocate for yourself at the school? What's it like to go and try to get a daycare spot? What's it like to go to the hospital if you can't advocate for yourself? What's it like trying to apply for a job? Like, there's so many things that get put in front of us when you're living in poverty, and even not even living in poverty, but sometimes as being an Indigenous person, like, there's a lot of barriers. And so one thing that I've tried to do with the work that I've done is to showcase some of the real shit that we go through as Indigenous people, but to also showcase the other side of it, right? And I always tell people all the time is that you can't have one without the other when you're doing this type of work. If you're doing the type of storytelling, it can't all just be the negative shit. It can't all just be the positive shit, right? Because you're doing a disservice to the community if you're only highlighting one over the other, right? And not everything is all great and not everything is all bad, right? Because there's a lot of good and there's a lot of bad in between. And so it's important to kind of balance that out as much as possible, right? And that's one of the reasons why I'm like, with a job like CBC Kids, like, I'm highlighting a lot of the positive stuff because Canadian kids across the country need to see that particular part of who we are. And if you're introducing that type of narrative to a younger audience, they're going to potentially look at how they view Indigenous people differently than, if they're only being introduced to it at 10, 12, 11, or 13 years old, whatever, where it's all negative, 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 right? And there's a thing that Duncan McHugh has coined, the 4 Ds. The only time that you see Indigenous people on the news is when they're dead, dancing, drumming, or drunk, right? And so we've kind of trying to do whatever we can to kind of counter those narratives and say, well, if you were to actually go to an Indigenous community or a First Nation and there's an event happening there, as an outsider, if you're an invited guest, you're gonna feel how welcoming we are. You're gonna see how beautiful the interactions are within our community. And that's not to say that there is no challenges. There's a lot of challenges, but if you're a part of the community and you're a non-Indigenous person, you're gonna be like, yeah, that was awesome, right? Like, I can't believe how welcoming everyone is. And more people need to see that kind of stuff.
Good that you're doing that with the CBC Kids, because you're working on dispelling those myths and misconceptions. So that's great work. And now let's move on to culture, memory, and reconciliation. Why was the return of the Tikanagan not a small story?
So just with things like that, like so the person that I talked to is Martina Fisher, and she's a respected elder that I've been able to meet with over the past, I don't know, since I was working. Her sister used to be the director of the Aboriginal Student Services at the University of Winnipeg when I went back in the day. But it's stories like that where it's like, if Winnipeg, Canada is not necessarily used to hearing those types of stories that are coming directly from the community. But if the community is reaching out to us and being like, hey, we want to be able to showcase this with you, right? Like, there's a lot of different things that have happened in our community where we need to be able to highlight them Stories like that particular one are interesting to me just because you're actually able to showcase that there's a relationship that's being restored, right? And if a museum decides to give back a Tikanagan, or if there's a museum decides to give back a headdress or whatever, like, there's a lot of historical injustices that have happened to our people that still need to be repaired. And so there's a lot of critiques that people have of the reconciliation era, or the word or whatever, that come from our community. And rightfully so, because a lot of it has been window dressing or lip service, or like, nothing beyond anything that's going to actually change the way that our communities uh, are. And so with certain things like that, it's like, there's a lot of stuff that we have, art, whatever it is, that could be returned to our communities and could be put up with prestige within our communities, right? And sometimes not even just about prestige, it's about, if there's something that meant a lot to your family and it's being returned to your family and in the possession of your family, like that could be something that's beautiful as well.
Now, what does reconciliation teach us about stewardship? Land.
I don't know about like other things, but I know that when it comes to things like land, right? Like there's a lot of knowledge about climate and stuff like that that's built into our languages and how we view the world and how we view the environment, right? And I think that it's not something that's the same all across all of the different Indigenous nations that or First Nations that are out there. But when it comes to the larger language groups, like there's certain things like, they say all my relations, or they say, it just kind of showcases that everything's connected, right? And I think that there's things that people can learn from our knowledge keepers that will translate towards a better future for non-Indigenous society as the years go by.
Okay. Now, how can journalism help moments of return?
Well, there was a story that just happened recently where there was a headdress that was given by a museum that was in it was the Long Plains chief that had their headdress in the museum that was just returned. I don't know if it was 60 years later. I saw the story a few days ago, but in cases like that, where there are lots of items that were taken and recovered, 100, 200, 300 years ago, like these are things and objects that could be displayed within our community, right? Because so much of our history was taken away from us, right? And so much of our knowledge was taken away from us. And when you add small pieces like a tikanagan or a headdress, you're reclaiming that part of your community's identity and another part of your community's history.
We're going to move on to murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and, responsible reporting. How do you report on violence without turning people into symbols?
One of the pieces that we did last year or this past year for CBC Kids was an MMIWG explainer for kids. And with that, it's like, how do you talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls to a younger audience, right? Like the target demographic for those particular videos is probably around 13 to 16 years old, to kind of showcase and highlight that there is an issue that our community faces, and to do it in a way that is understandable for young people, but also, and it's the same thing with like reporting on residential schools, right? You don't want to water it down. You don't want to whitewash it. You also want to make sure that you're honoring the people that are a part of these situations or are involved, and to do it in a way that is going to be educational. And so that's it can be a challenge like that. But I think one of the things that I've learned about journalism is that oftentimes communities don't see themselves reflected in the person that they see on TV. They're just going to tune out, right? And for us, it's like, how do we put a human face onto these stories to make it so that it does feel universal? But the reality of the situation is sometimes is that the things that we experience as Indigenous people aren't universal to everybody else in this country. The one thing that would be kind of universal sometimes is like poverty, human emotion.
Mm-hmm. Now, what is the danger of closure narratives? I mean, with murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, not a continual conversation, because it seems that to some degree, until the next person comes up, then it's brought up in the, onto the news again. But it doesn't seem to be something that is consistently, I think, worked on.
There have been a number of projects that have been done around MMIWG2S. There was a big project that came out. I don't know if it was the 4-year anniversary of the inquiry. It was released by the CBC and CBC Manitoba. And they also did a project that was a database that included as many people as they could find that were in a missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls database. But when it comes to this particular issue, the reason why it feels like it's being closed or onto the next one is because it's onto the next one within our community, right? That's the reality of what it's like to be an Indigenous woman, girl, two-spirit in this country, is that everyone kind of expects that is going to happen, right? And it doesn't happen like that within any other community, right? It's because of the way that our people are viewed in this society. And that's why I say, like, things are questionable when you ask how much have things changed over the last 10 years or where are we at today, right? Like, it's just the reality of being an Indigenous person in this country.
Now let's move to politics and accountability. How does media shape Indigenous political?
I think that media can add legitimacy to people, right? And there's there's sometimes a risk of legitimizing people that might not always need to be legitimized, but it kind of goes back to, if somebody's being ridiculous and this is what they're saying, you got to kind of leave it up to the audience to make that decision. But I think that the relationship should be there because, you know what, we need to have our leaders out there advocating for the issues. We need to make sure that we do have representatives that are going to be able to challenge the status quo, right? And we need to make sure that our communities also have the ability to criticize leaders when, they might have their concerns and stuff like that. And so the beauty of having a media platform is that you're potentially able to reach thousands of people every single day. Whereas social media, you're at the risk of the algorithm, right? And you might not be able to reach anyone if there's advocacy. So I do think that there's an important relationship that I think a lot of First Nations and Indigenous leaders understand. So we need to make sure that we've got our voices represented.
Now, do Indigenous leaders get framed differently?
I think that there's an argument that could be made that Indigenous leaders do get framed differently, right? Like we get othered everywhere else in the media, right? And, we run the risk of looking like activists about every single thing or complainers or, another stereotype that comes up for Indigenous leaders is like, they're all thieves or whatever. Like, even looking at the comments of somebody like Wab Canoe, right? He's just a drunk, right? He's promoting this and that. And it's like, you really can't win sometimes with certain people, right? But like I said, it kind of goes back to being able to showcase multiple perspectives, right? Some leader over here is not going to think the same thing as this leader over here. Not everybody always gets along. Some people get along, some people don't, right? And so it's important to showcase as many perspectives as possible.
Now, how does colonial language persist in political reporting today?
I think that there's rules that you have to stick by when it comes to journalism. I think that there's certain things that you can change, whether it's like the flow or adding like your own kind of flavor to it. Like the journalism needs to stay journalism is the way that I kind of have come to understand it. But it kind of depends on your editors and it depends on how much experience you have at the same time, right? If you're a young person and you're just trying to learn and you're trying to figure out how to do something, like you're kind of at the whim of a more experienced journalist who might guide you in the right direction, who might guide you in the wrong direction, right? And so sometimes it depends on who you're working for. But one thing that I know is that language is important. right? It's important and words are important. And I've always tried to write things from the perspective that our community will understand and that our community will kind of come up to their own conclusions with, but to not rely so heavily on the non-Indigenous experience.
Okay. Now, let's move to Indigenous health. And I know you've done a lot of work around this. How do you report health without reducing people to outcomes?
So I just recently started working on Indigenous health. I've only been doing this for 6 months. I've done a little bit of health reporting previously, but I've been doing CBC Kids for the last 3 years. I pitched HIV rates in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, looking at the Indigenous communities who are experiencing HIV. And whenever you look at the stories about HIV within our communities, it's just numbers, stats, right? And there's no personal touch that's added to these particular stories, whether it be the relationships that people have with the community and not being able to find voices to represent these stories. That's questionable, that's understandable. But with stories like this one, like the way that I see it is that we need to be able to figure out to put that human touch on it to make it so that people understand that these are our sisters, our cousins, our aunties, our uncles, like people that are within our communities that are experiencing these issues, that they can understand and learn from it. They can understand and come up with their own conclusion with it, right? Hopefully, like my fellowship, I'm on a 1-year fellowship. It's my goal is to have it be that, people have a much better understanding of what it is. There's stigma, that there are people, and yeah, hopefully people like the project when it's done.
Now, we talk about trauma-informed care. What does trauma-informed journalism look like?
The example that I give to everyone is working on residential school stories, right? So if I'm an interviewer and I'm asking you a question, I could ask you, tell me a story about the hardest time that you ever went through in residential schools. And you, as somebody who's being interviewed, just kind of breaks down because it takes you back to a moment where you're like, yeah, that was probably one of the worst moments of my life. And I remember this, and this happening. And when the interview is over, you can't believe that you just finished saying that to a person with a camera and a microphone. And then you feel like shit about it afterwards. And then you start questioning, and then you start opening up all of these memories of bad things that happened to you when you were a kid. That's an example of not trauma-informed journalism. One of the things that I always tell people all the time before we interview is that, I don't want to ask you about the toughest thing that you went through, right? If I always tell younger journalists, like, you never want to ask a question that is going to open up a wound that you can't close before the end of the interview, right? And if you ask a question like that, you got to be prepared for it in terms of, are you going to be able to support this person? Do you have support from somebody else that's going to be there? It's kind of knowing the subject matter, right? Like, if we're talking about things like sexual assault or something like that, like that's going to trigger something, and you kind of have to know beforehand that it could potentially trigger something, right? And so it's always good to kind of know what you're talking about and how it might affect the person that you're interviewing, but not just that, but also the people that might be reading it, right? There's certain shows that exist around the Indigenous experience that have come out over the last 5 to 10 years. And I tell people, I'm like, some of that shit is just not for me. And I'm not saying that it's not for me. I'm saying that they're making it so that a non-Indigenous audience can experience it, and so that they know what happens, because we already know without having to say that we know what happened, right? We know these things already. But for the people that might have zero baseline understanding of what happened in those schools, there's shows like that exist. There's books like that exist. And for some of us as Indigenous people, like, how much do we want to see that? So.
Right. Now, where does the health system still fail Indigenous communities?
It's a big question. I do think that it's a structural question, right? Like, we think about resources. One of the current things that always happens is if somebody's living in the city and they're always going back and forth. Let's say, for instance, they get sick with something like HIV and they go back home. Is the province covering it? Is the feds covering it because their status, or is it a provincial responsibility, right? And so people always get caught up in the jurisdictional limbo over who's going to cover this, right? And if we'll use HIV as an example. If there is somebody that is HIV positive that is in the community, what does post-care look like and whose responsibility is that going to be? Are there enough resources that are going to be available within a small community or a small First Nation to be able to support that person, right? And if a nursing station is always in crisis mode, how are they going to be able to deal with somebody that's living with HIV? And then you take that on to things like diabetes and kidney failure and all of these other different things. Like there's a whole bunch of different systemic inequalities that exist that it's hard to address all of them because there's so many of them, right? And so there's a lot of challenges that exist for our people. And I always tell people all the time, like, our people get failed in 4 different systems throughout the course of their life. Oftentimes it's the education system, the CFS system, the justice system, and the healthcare system, right? And not saying that everyone goes through all 4 of them, but sometimes it's 1, sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's all of them. And so that's not true for everybody, but those are like some main drivers where we have a lot of barriers for our people. And a lot of it comes down to, again, when you asked me a question about policies earlier, sometimes it comes down to political will, right? Like, I think that healthcare system or healthcare work is not just something, wanting to change healthcare is not just something that's limited to our community. It's part of an overall push to kind of change the way that healthcare is delivered to Canadians. And so it's kind of a bit of a tricky question.
It's big, the issue of healthcare for Indigenous communities. It's a big issue, and it's not an easy one to solve for sure. There's so much complexity. Now, Red Rising magazine. Why was Red Rising necessary?
I think at the time it was just like a moment in time, right? Like, it was a beautiful moment in time. It's something that I'm still super proud of when I think about it. Red Rising was meant to be like an unfiltered space for Indigenous writers, Indigenous artists and thinkers and whatnot. And we were able to kind of capture a lot of the movement that was happening within our country at the time, right? Like, Idle No More happened in 2013. We're coming off of the waves that, introduced a lot of new activism and a lot of new activists to the country at the time. There was a lot of voices that we captured at that time. I think that a lot of the people that submitted for our magazine were and are leaders of their community, but also like first time being published in our magazine. Like, that was my first time being published. And I just think that there's always going to be a need or a space that could exist for that type of platform or communications, right? Like, you need people that are in any community to be able to say what needs to be said, right? Because if you look at the professional class, like, the professional class is not going to say it. The people that have a platform can say whatever needs to be said. And so I definitely think that there's a need for both styles of writing.
Mm-hmm. Now, what stories emerge when Indigenous audiences are centered, specifically when you're writing for Red River?
I think as a communicator, you always need to figure out who your audience is. For me, I started Red Rising in 2015 with my friends, and I've been at the CBC for 10 years. So for me, it's always been an Indigenous audience. And I want to
Who are the members you started that with? I'm sorry for interrupting, but I'm just curious.
There was like Kevin, Satish, Sadie, Phoenix. There was Charlie Crow, Ashley Richard, Justin Larive. We had a few non-Indigenous members like Annie Chen. I've been doing storytelling for about 10 years through Red Rising and through CBC. The things that I pitch, the things that I want to talk about, like, again, it goes back to, I want to talk about things that are important to me. I want to talk about things that are serious, that highlight some of the challenges that I see our people going through. When it's stuff like that, it's kind of geared towards like a non-Indigenous audience. And sometimes it's like an education awareness that needs to happen within our own community, or sometimes it's breaking down an issue that I think a wider audience needs to know. When it comes to the project that I'm working on with HIV, I'm going at it in a way that my aunties, my mom, my uncles, my cousins, they need to understand it. And they need to see it being done in a way that is not like, fear mongering or, trying to scare people into being like, oh, you need to think about this. It's just like, no, it's here. Here's how we're going to talk about it. Like, here's some of the things that are happening. Here's some of the things that you should be aware about. I think that, if we're creating content for Indigenous people, like, I don't know, I just want to do cool shit. I want to be able to showcase or highlight like the positives that are happening in our community. So for me, it's always been a mix. Like I want to do the fun stuff, but I also want to do the serious stuff at the same time.
What advice do you give to emerging Indigenous writers?
Writers in particular, I think if I was to give advice to writers, would be to read as much as possible, to write as much as possible, to find your own voice. One piece of advice that I gave to somebody recently is that if you're smart, you don't need to prove that you're smart. I think that when people are trying to establish themselves as writers, they have a need to feel like, I'm going to write in an academic way and I'm going to try to over explain things. If you give it time, your brilliance is going to come across anyways, right? And so there's no need to go and try to use the $10 words to get a point across. When I post stuff, most of the time I'm just shit posting most of the time, but I can write things in a way that you're going to say, okay, this is the way that this guy talks, right? This is the way that this guy is. This is how he thinks about things. And so it's always good to, think things through. I always, my own personal process is like, I'm always thinking about things. And then when it's time to write, I'll go and sit down and just bang it out. But the big thing is like being true to yourself and being true to your own voice.
That's really good advice for young emerging Indigenous writers. Now, is there a story you still carry with you that you would want to share?
Like a story that I've worked on or a story that's with me?
A story that's with you, but you haven't been able to express.
I mean, like I would like to write a book one of these days. A story that I would like to express. Well, prior to COVID happening, I was supposed to do a radio documentary on going to find my biological dad. And my biological dad is Vietnamese, and it's something that's always kind of been there. And it's something that is in the background for me. And I'm trying to see if I could go and find one of his relatives or himself before he passes away. I know that I have a brother out there that's probably around the same age as my son. And it's something that I would like, even if that relationship doesn't happen, I would like to go to Vietnam and see what that's like. And for me, that's like a story that exists here, but hasn't been able to be put down just yet. And I feel like that's an important part of anything that could be written or whatever else.
In closing, Leonard, throughout this conversation, you've reminded us that stories don't end when they're told. They live on in families, in communities, in systems that either change or refuse to. Before we close, I want to return to something quiet but essential. Many people listen to interviews like this and feel moved, informed, even unsettled, and then they go on with their lives. For someone listening right now, especially a teacher, a journalist, a policymaker, or simply a neighbor, what is the smallest meaningful responsibility that comes after hearing these stories?
I just want people to be able to understand that there are a lot of challenges that come up with being an Indigenous person. And if you work with Indigenous people, like you kind of have to know what these challenges look like and how to be an ally. But a big thing is like, how do you be a community member, right? There's so many people that just don't talk to their neighbor anymore. There's so many people that don't talk to each other on the street. And I think that there's a shared humanity that exists that has been suppressed in social media that we will hopefully go back to at some point and be like, okay, here's how I look out for people. Here's how I look out for my community, right? And for me personally, like if you're thinking about Indigenous youth or you work with Indigenous youth, I'm here today personally because of people that have helped me to get here, right? And people that saw potential in me, people that saw how smart I was and whatnot. And they saw things in me that I didn't always see in myself. And so I always appreciate the people that are willing to kind of figure out, okay, well, here's how we be a better community member and here's how we're going to be a better ally to each other. And so if there are people out there, read a little bit more, read as much as you can if you need to know if that's something that you're passionate about. So that would be the best advice I would have.
Now, reach, clicks, and immediacy are often used to measure the effectiveness of journalism. But there's another measure, one that doesn't show up in analytics. It's whether a story was told with care, whether it left space for dignity, whether it asks us not just to know more, but to be different. Lenard Monkman's work reminds us that listening is not passive. It is an act of responsibility. Thank you, Leonard, for trusting us with these stories, and thank you for listening. Thank you, Leonard.
Thank you.
I'm Gerard Damon, and this has been Across This Quiet Land, Stories from the Hearts of Canada. Until next time.